Did I press the buttons? Good? Good. All right. Yeah, hey everybody, thank you for coming. This is my personal single directory components workflow. So yeah, just the process that I went through kind of the first time I used single directory components on like a full-scale Drupal project. It's awesome being back at mid-camp. I live out in the suburbs in Palatine, so this is my home camp, which is super fun. Yeah, the bit.ly link for the slides down there if you're interested in following along. But let's dive in. Yeah, I'm Brian Perry. I have been working with Drupal at this point for 12 or so years. Like focusing on front-end things. Recently have been interested in using Drupal as a decoupled front-end. Also really love Nintendo and video games. Very excited for the impending release of Switch 2. I got a pre-order. As far as games I've been playing this game called Blueprints. Anybody hear of that game? Yeah. It's yeah, a really wild puzzle game. I've kind of enjoyed playing it, but also kind of hated it at the same time. But yeah, check it out if you're into really unique, like first-person puzzle experiences. Yeah, and I'm on Blue Sky at brianperry.dev. Goodbye Twitter forever. And yeah, I currently work at a company called Actual AI. So I've actually been a little bit outside of the Drupal world the past couple months, working on this app, which is doing a lot of work in React. But yeah, what Actual AI is, it is a tool to assist development managers, and it can import your code base and basically analyze your commits to get summary data and trends over time to help give you information on performance and kind of things that might fall through the cracks, especially in the world that we're in now, where with AI it's possible to produce a whole lot of additional code. So if you're interested in learning more or want to check it out, come chat. As I have been working in React recently, I do love the JavaScript frameworks, but the reality of it is that for some use cases, some projects, they are potentially overkill. So you don't necessarily need to throw React at everything, even though people might want you to believe that. So this leads me to what basically was, this project was essentially the first like full-on Drupal theme I had done in probably about 3 years. So it was really interesting to be able to look at what has changed as far as Drupal's theming, have just general developments in modern front-end development and new web standards. Is that going to make my life easy? And this theme that I was working on was relatively straightforward, not super complicated, didn't need like a ton of interactivity. So I wondered, using a more kind of vanilla workflow, will I miss my fancy old frameworks? And then the other big question that I had is, will single directory components solve all of my problems? I had definitely been following along with the development of single directory components, but this was, my first opportunity to really kind of make it a core part of a theming workflow for a real live project. So before we talk about how I use it within my workflow, let's just cover the basics of what single directory components are briefly, or SDCs for short. So the biggest thing is that it's Drupal's core front-end component primitive. Now there actually is the concept of a component, which I believe is like a component class. But before, there were a whole lot of ways that we, in themes, were making things that were reusable, Twig templates that we could include or embed, but there wasn't any official way to tell Drupal, hey, this is a component. There were a set of common practices, but Drupal really didn't have that concept. So now that Drupal has that, there are, obviously there is a standard way to approach that, but also it's allowing Drupal to build tools and a contrib ecosystem on top of it as well, which is pretty awesome. So, what actually is a single directory component? It is all of the things live in a single directory, unsurprisingly. And it can have a YAML file. I believe it has to have the YAML file. It can be very stripped down, as we'll see in a second. That YAML file can optionally define a schema for your component. It can have a Twig template. If it doesn't have a Twig template, it's probably not going to be super useful, but I believe that is optional. And other assets are optional too. It may or may not have a CSS file. It may or may not have a JavaScript file. And all of those files will have the same, the file name will essentially be the machine name of the component, as we'll see in a second. So, as opposed to themes in the past where all of those assets could live wherever, you always know in your one directory there are all the things that are going to be used to render this component. So yeah, it simplifies the process of reusable components in Drupal in a variety of ways. There is a defined standard now. All your stuff is in one place. Another wonderful thing is that it will automatically load any of those assets and create a library for them. You don't have to manually define a library. You can override that library if you want to, but it just will magically load the stuff, which is great. And I edited this one bullet since the last time I gave this talk. In some ways, single directory components will also reduce the hunting that you have to do for hooks and preprocessed functions and so on. My understanding is that it was a kind of a very intentional design decision to make sure that single directory components essentially can't be altered after they're defined. So you can't have a hook that completely changes your single directory component. However, in practice, you still will have to deal with pre-processing things to get data into your component. So once you get to your component, you know that it's going to render using the files in that directory, but it's not necessarily going to completely stop you from having to find where pre-process is happening. Additionally, there also is now a contrib ecosystem that's being built on top of single directory components. Also, Experience Builder uses single directory components. So now that we have this standard in the wonderful way that Drupal and the Drupal ecosystem does, we're building exciting new tools on top of it. So let's get into my workflow. So this is the way that I incorporated single directory components into the theme and my workflow. There is going to be a distinction here, some things that are single directory component things, and other things that are really me things. So some of these things are just like personal preferences, things that I find useful. I will try to call out the Brian things along the way when we get to them. So what we're using as an example here is to basically change the look and feel of the card components in Drupal CMS. I believe these aren't actually single directory components, or at least weren't when I put this example together. And it's not to say that this design isn't nice, but as we're going to see, you can certainly change things pretty substantially. So, a new design for these cards, pretty standard, image, heading, body kind of stuff here. Personally, I like to do prototyping as part of my workflow. So sometimes this can be really useful on a project where there may be back-end functionality that these components are going to depend on that hasn't been implemented yet. So being able to do prototyping outside of Drupal can help you get a jump start on some of these components before the back-end functionality exists. And in general, it's just a nice lightweight way to get started on some of these things. So for this particular example, I also had the fun experience of trying to see what I could get AI to put together for these cards. So I specifically used bolt.new, which allows you to spin up basically like a full project based on your prompts. And I asked it to make a card with I think a retro style design was what I prompted it. Here's what it came up with. And specifically, some of the prompts that I had to use here, which is kind of interesting. So if you just say, give me a card component, based on the fact that a lot of those tools are JavaScript tools in general, and also that a lot of these models are trained pretty heavily on JavaScript. If you just prompt to say, give me a card, it's probably going to get you some React. It's just going to spit out some React. So I did have to be pretty explicit about I wanted the card to just use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because that's stuff that we can very easily port into our single directory component. I told it to give it a retro style. I asked it to use Drupal's brand colors, which I thought was kind of cool, and it knew how to do that. And I also asked it to add a JavaScript-based interaction. That's kind of overkill for a card like this, but it's helpful to show some of the examples of what you can do with JavaScript and single directory components. So going back to prototyping, the tool that I like to use for prototyping is Astro, which is technically a JavaScript framework. But the reason that I like to use Astro is it has its own kind of component concept that is very similar at its base to just like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we'll see in some of these examples. So it can map really nicely to Drupal here. So first step, I want to create this card, and I'm starting with the prototype. So the first thing that I need to do is add the libraries that this component will depend on. In this case, I wanted to make sure that it had the Olivero base styles, so that when I was prototyping this, compared to when I drop it into Drupal, it's going to look the same and have all of the same base styles. You may also want to use some sort of supporting library or CSS framework or something. I've been using recently a couple small libraries, one called Pico, which is like a minimal CSS framework just for kind of base HTML elements. And then also a library called OpenProps, which is basically just a set of CSS variables that has things like spacing scale and colors, and I find that stuff very useful. For others, this may be including Tailwind, if you're the type of person who enjoys using Tailwind. I'll leave my personal opinions about Tailwind for another discussion later. But yeah, so add the libraries that you need, and then the next step is just having some basic markup for the structure of the component. So nothing super shocking here. It's really just kind of fleshing out the structure, and you can see the things that kind of come through from the base Olivero CSS here. So we already see the basic pieces of our component. And then a thing that I like to do and did on this project is I will use a custom element for these components, primarily for scoping of the styles. So in this case, I used a custom element retro card. So you can actually see it on the previous example. There's actually that retro card element up at the top. And it turns out that a custom element, a custom tag like that is just completely valid HTML. You might not think that you can just make up whatever tag name you want, but you certainly can. As long as it has that dash in it, so it doesn't conflict with any of the base HTML elements. And then as we'll see in a bit, that makes it really easy to scope your CSS rules to that element, because nobody else has a retro card element. And then also, as we'll see in this example, it provides a way, if you do have interactivity, you can upgrade it to be an actual web component for interactivity. So I like being able to have that element for scoping, and then when there does need to be interactivity, it's nice that you can just give it that nice little upgrade. Next is looking at the concept of props and slots in your component. In general, working with the JavaScript frameworks, they all have a concept of props and slots. And the great thing with single directory components is we have that same concept, and it maps really nicely to what I'm familiar with from the JavaScript frameworks as well. If you're not familiar with props and slots, the general way that I like to think about them is that slots are basically like, you know, a hole in your component that you can put things into. And typically that's going to be best for unstructured data, like markup or other components which in and of themselves will have markup. And then props, you can think of like attributes on an HTML element, and typically those are like key value pairs that you're passing into the component. So looking at our card, you know, things that we might want to have for, I believe, yeah, this would be the slots. Astro just uses a slot tag to represent a slot. And there's just a couple that we have here. One is for the image, and the other one is for the body. Image is a good example in that just something that I found as a best practice. You know, it depends a little bit on exactly what you're looking to do, but I find that if you can get away with using Drupal's image markup, you know, a full slot for that image where you're just going to place where you want to, it's going to make your life a lot easier because you can use the things that Drupal does well regarding images, like responsive image styles and all of that stuff, and all of those optimizations. And then you just, you know, add the styling on top of it, rather than like actually digging into the image and getting the image URL and handling all of that stuff yourself. You certainly can do that, but it's a lot of work. So images are often great to just use wholesale from Drupal when you can as slots. The body is another good example of that because, you know, in this case, it's you know, a CK editor field that can have you know, any unstructured markup. And then looking at how we'd actually reference the card here, we can see an example of some of the things that would be treated here as props. So in this example, there's the date, there is a tag, and then the title and the URL for the link are all things that we're, in this example, treating as props. And then for Astro's you know, structure here, you just specify a slot attribute and the name of the slot to be able to fill in something as a slot. So in this just prototype example, we just have an image tag and then some body text. And then in Astro, and we'll see in a bit that single directory components have this same kind of concept, you can use TypeScript to be able to define more specifically the type of your props. This is pretty boring in that they all ended up being strings in this case, but there definitely are other options for the essentially the schema of your component. And then, so you can validate against this using TypeScript. So if you tried to pass a number into the title, for example, you'll get a nice little error. And then next, in the prototyping phase, layering on some styles here. The styles themselves aren't super important, especially because our friend the robot generated them for us. But just the big thing here is that we're using that retro card custom element to scope the styles. So they're all inside of that retro card element. So the styles here aren't going to leak out to anything else. They're just going to be applied to this one component, where in this case, that's exactly what we want. So now we have our fancy retro-looking card now. And then also we, you know, a little bit of a contrived example, but asked it to add some JavaScript. So if you click on the image or the tag, it does this cool little glitch effect. And here is the JavaScript that was provided by the AI. So pretty simple query selector, and then it's basically just adding a couple of classes when they're clicked on to have that style. So Pretty simple, straightforward JavaScript there. But as I kind of touched on before, this is actually a good example of when you might want to actually upgrade this to be an actual HTML web component. So why would you do that? It's kind of similar to some of the things that we were looking at with just using the element in general, but it helps with scoping. So think of using jQuery in a Drupal theme. If you wanted to add this sort of interactivity to a card, you'd basically have to query the DOM and find all of the instances of the card to add the on-click handlers for these things. Instead, if you make this a web component by extending the HTML element class, it's just going to act on this one instance of the web component. So you don't have to look at the entire DOM. You don't have to worry about accidentally doing weird stuff to other things on the screen. It's just going to apply to this element. And also, it's a really nice progressive enhancement because this glitch effect obviously is not necessarily required. It's a nice little icing on the cake. If somebody has JavaScript off or there's something wrong with your JavaScript and it fails, we still have the card. We just don't have this little progressive enhancement of the fancy glitch. Okay, so now we prototyped the card outside of Drupal. So what does it look like if we're going to create that as a single component in Drupal? And the good thing, this is something that I was particularly interested in going from doing a lot of work in JavaScript frameworks to Drupal. The great thing is that the process is pretty similar to what we walk through outside of Drupal. There's nice parallels to all of these kind of component pieces. So, step one, you create a single directory for your single directory component. Who knew? So it needs to live in a components directory, and it's a subdirectory of either a module or a theme. You can create a single directory component in either of those. So we just have our card directory. First thing we do is create a card.component.yaml file. And this is the absolute bare minimum of what you would need in that YAML file, the machine name. And it's a little annoying, but even if you don't have props, you have to have an empty props object for this to validate. I don't believe that has changed in single directory components. So that's the bare minimum of what you would need in the YAML file for it to be a real thing. And then next, we're going to create a Twig template for it. So this would be card.twig in the same directory. As a starting point, we're just using that retro card element, have the text card component that shows up on the screen. A nice little note is that this is just card.twig. It doesn't have to have the HTML.twig extension that's required for Twig templates in themes. Next, so at this point we're basically just trying to get the bare minimum representation of a component to show up in Drupal. So we're adding our CSS file, card.css. We're just adding one simple rule scoped to that retro card element again. We'll add a whole bunch more markup and styles later. And now we can use it. So in our theme, in this case I created a custom theme based off of Olivero. We need to find, in this case, the node card HTML.twig template that is going to essentially be like the view mode for this card. And we're going to use just a standard Twig embed, as we see down there at the bottom. And the way that we reference this component is the machine name of the theme, a colon, and then the machine name of the component. So in this case, Drupal CMS Olivero SDC card. And you can use, I believe you can use either include or embed for these in your Twig templates, but if you are working with props and slots, you're gonna, in many cases, want to use embed anyway. So now we have our mostly useless component up on the screen. But that's the base of what we need to get Drupal to actually render it and recognize it. So now we can layer on the pieces that we've had previously. So first, we'll go ahead and populate some of the slots. So remember, in our prototype, we had a slot element that had a name. That's the body slot. So the Drupal version of this, the single directory component version of this, you would first define the slot in your YAML file. So under slots, we have our body slot, and we give it a title and a description. And then in the Twig template, you represent that as a block. So we have a block named body that is basically just a placeholder for that slot, as we see there. And then once that's defined in the template, when we're actually using the single directory component, embedding it here, inside of the block tags, we just can put whatever markup we need. And in this case, we're just rendering the field. I think I jumped from body to image in this example, but you get the general idea. So I'm removing the image field to render the body. Anyway, so we are actually just having Drupal render that in the Twig template like we would in a regular Twig template, just in that slot. And then after dealing with the slots, we can look at the props. So thinking back to the prototype, we had essentially attributes that were representing the props. So what you would need to do in your single directory component to have the same thing is define. This is essentially where you're defining the schema of your component. It basically is using, I think it is literally using JSON schema format. So here we're saying that the date prop is of type string, and we give it a title and a description. And again, these are all strings, but there are other types that can be used there. And now if we want to use that in our Twig template, it is just like a Twig variable, which you are likely already familiar with. So we have the date variable that we can just place wherever we want in markup. And then when we are using the component in our embed, we say with, and then there is essentially just an object that is the date prop, and then the value for the date here, which just happens to be the date field in this case. So yeah, you will pass in all of the props, and then they'll be rendered out on the screen. The other piece of the puzzle here, in our prototype component, we use TypeScript to define essentially the schema of the component, and single directory components can do the same thing. Because we have the schema in the YAML file, we can validate against it. And I think the rule is that you have to have a schema, and that schema will be validated if your single directory component is in a module. And if it's in a theme, if you want to enforce a schema, you have to add that enforce prop schemas option. But again, that can be very nice in that if somewhere along the way you are providing the wrong type of data to this component, it will yell at you very loudly. And then JavaScript. So we have that little bit of interactivity that we saw. This is a really cool example in that because we're just using something that's part of the web platform at this point, the concept of a web component or a HTML element, there is literally no modifications that we need to do to this JavaScript at all. It's just our card.js file in that directory. Drupal automatically loads it as part of the library, and it just works, which is awesome. So this is what we ended up with. These nice components with that fun little glitch, little over-the-top styling, but very nice that we can have, in a theme like Olivero, this very opinionated component that is always going to render like this, and we can use it all throughout Drupal in all of the ways that we want to. And so, this is obviously a very step-by-step version of the workflow that I use. I personally really like the process of starting with the simplest little version of something and then slowly layering on the pieces. But if that's too many steps for you, you can use Drush. There's a generate SDC command, and it'll ask you all kinds of questions, like if you want to have JavaScript, CSS, what your props are, what your slots are, and it will spit out all of the boilerplate for your single directory component for you, which is awesome. And then we have talked a little bit about schemas and everything so far, and especially if you are used to past versions of defining components in Drupal. Initially, the idea of having to define a schema for a component can feel maybe like overkill or like a little bit of additional work. But it really does have some advantages. Even in cases in themes where you don't necessarily have to define a schema, I always prefer to. So there's the validation piece of it, but also it can kind of give you some cool superpowers here in that if you have a clearly defined schema, you can create many variations of components that just use and depend on that same schema. So this is another card that looks completely different. It's not all ridiculously retro, but it has all the same elements and the exact same schema. So if you had two versions of this single directory component that is created, if you wanted to switch from the retro card to our fancy business style card, it literally is just as simple as using the different SDC machine name. The schema is exactly the same, so you don't have to change anything else, which is really cool. So yeah, some other questions you might have kind of going through this process. You might wonder where your fancy build process went. So part of what I was looking to do in this theme, in this particular example, is really try to kind of look at the whole other side of, compared to the JavaScript framework world, how simple can I make the build process here? How much of just general web platform features can I use? So there actually is no build process at all in the theme that I created and this example. It's just using the things that Drupal has for single directory components and just regular CSS and JavaScript. For regular CSS, a lot of the features of Sass, I think Marky might have had a talk about this yesterday or something. A lot of things that we might have relied on for Sass and compiling CSS in the past, we don't really need to do anymore. All those features are just kind of in the platform. So for this, no build at all. It's definitely possible that you might have a more complex build process that you need to incorporate into part of this, but and I think we'll talk about that on an additional slide. But basically, single directory components don't really care about your build process. You just need to have the necessary files in that one directory, and you're good. So also, there were some contrib tools that I found really helpful in building out a full theme using single directory components. The first is the no markup module. There have been many variations on this kind of concept throughout the years, but this is definitely a really great implementation of it. It allows you to strip basically all the wrapping markup from a field. So if you, for example, just literally want the text of a title, you can use this to get that rather than having a bunch of wrapping divs. So for the tags, for example, you can just flip on the remove field markup box here. And yeah, you'll get just the value for the tags, which can be very nice. There's also the Twig tweak module. You still may find yourself needing to do some mapping in your Twig templates to get at a specific field or variable. So Twig can be really useful. There's a bunch of utilities that can help you out. In general, I would, though, ask yourself, if you find yourself doing a whole lot of manipulation in your Twig template, is there any way that you can simplify it or let Drupal do a little bit more of, or use a little bit more of Drupal's defaults? So going really wild with Twig, speaking personally, can be a bit of a code smell. Some other things that are useful out there, there is an SDC style guide module. When I first put this talk together, it was pretty early. I haven't checked back in on it since, but yeah, the idea is it provides in Drupal a style guide that shows examples of all of your single directory components. There also is a SDC block module, which will create blocks automatically based on all of your single directory components. Because we have that defined schema, it makes stuff like that possible. So you can place blocks anywhere based on your SDCs and provide values for all of your fields. Then there's a couple, there's a theme and also a project that if you're looking for example implementations of single directory components, it's a great place to look. So there's the Radix theme, which is a theme that has just a full implementation of a bunch of core components that are all SDCs. And then the UI patterns suite of modules, which was kind of a past approach at being able to represent components in Drupal. The 2x version of that also uses single directory components as well. So yeah, if you're looking for more complex examples, those would be great places to look. And then some gotchas that you might find with this process. We touched on a lot of these along the way, but if you find yourself, you may find yourself fighting Drupal's markup and trying to strip out elements. So some of the tools like that no markup module might help you, but if you find yourself in that situation, ask yourself if maybe something that you're trying to treat as a prop and pass in as a key value pair might be better handled as a slot. So yeah, that's just kind of a question you can ask yourself if you find yourself fighting against Drupal's markup more than you want to. We talked about the build process. SDCs are definitely kind of independent of your build process. If you do want to use something like Sass or have other more detailed libraries that you need to include, you might need a build process. So that can potentially add some complication, but again, at the end of the day, for SDCs, all that needs to happen is those files just need to end up in that directory. So it's probably a matter of just, for example, configuring your bundler to spit out files with a specific naming convention in a particular place. And something that's kind of more of a me thing, given that I do like using custom elements in this process, I did run into an issue where it's, you might not think about it, but it's a little bit harder to embed. There's some challenges embedding web components in CK editor fields because it's restricted to a particular set of tags. There is a module called embedded content, which I also haven't had a chance to loop back and check out, but my understanding is that it provides some options to be able to solve that problem of using custom elements in a field like that. And yeah, so I think I did enjoy my experience with single directory components in a full theme. It does improve dealing with components in Drupal. It definitely doesn't solve all of the world's problems, but is, yeah, a great step, and it's exciting that as people adopt SDCs and use them, we can kind of build the ecosystem around it. The things that I'd love to see in the future is being able to handle that kind of field mapping in the UI. UI patterns in the past and the 2x version of UX patterns provide some tools around that. And I believe there could be other SDC modules that handle this, but that also definitely is a piece that Experience Builder is trying to solve. So the hope is that Experience Builder might be the way to be able to handle that kind of component mapping in the future. And it seems to be well on its way to providing that, which is cool. And then there also are some like kind of wilder concepts of being able to include JavaScript framework like components in Drupal. And if you think about it, even Experience Builder actually has to solve that problem because it is React at the end of the day. So it has to be able to take representations of the Drupal data and pass that along to a JavaScript framework. So the idea of being able to hand off to a JavaScript framework at essentially like any level of your Drupal theme would be a nice kind of future version of this. So I'm interested to see what the Experience Builder work makes possible. That's definitely not one of the primary or even maybe stated goals of Experience Builder, but I'm very curious for what it ends up making possible in like Drupal theming in general. And yeah, that's pretty much it. We do have a few minutes for questions if anybody has questions. Yes?
Have you looked into the SDC display module?
I don't believe I have. What is that?
It's really nice. You can actually like choose the SDC you want and map the fields to the
great.
and the slots.
Excellent.
So yeah,
Okay.
check that out.
Great.
I don't even really have to mess with the Twig templates anymore.
Great. That's exactly what I was looking for. So the question was, have I looked at the SDC display module? And I hadn't, but I will. And it basically allows you to handle the mapping in the UI, which is amazing. Cool. Yes, Chris.
Have you tried out the SDC develop module?
I think I have.
It's a great linter for your components that you've created. Understand if you've messed up anything about the schema, about your component modeling.
Excellent. Yeah, so that tip was the SDC devel module, which can serve as a great linter for you. See, the contrib ecosystem popping up around this stuff. It's great. Yes?
When you implemented the body as a slot, you showed, so it looked like it had some properties. I think it was a title and body. So does it look for that in the Twig variable that you put in? If you put in content without the image field, is it going to look for a content type title, content type body? Like, how does it know?
Yeah, so the question was for the example where we were passing in a slot, is it checking for particular fields? How does it know what's being put in there? And my understanding is that it really doesn't. That is basically just a place where you can pass any rendered element or markup. So slots are definitely unstructured and kind of the Wild West compared to props that have to follow a particular explicit schema.
Okay, so maybe I thought I saw some properties though in the content slide. It was kind of complicated.
I was just using the Twig folder.
Yeah. Yeah, that was probably a maybe unnecessarily complicated example. Is this what you were referring to?
A little back.
Little back?
But yeah, that's close. So yes, you had the title, body.
Yep, and those are basically just what is going to display in the UI for the component. So, yeah. Yes?
I was going to ask on that one slide why you went with content without as opposed to just doing content.body.
Yeah, honestly, I cannot remember. It definitely would have been a little clearer and more straightforward if I didn't do that.
Well, for instance, though, if you had body and then some blurb field or something like that, it would have done them both here, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Clearly, that's what you were going for.
Yes.
So about your future stuff, I can say, like, for those who don't know, XP is using Astro, actually, because it has JavaScript components. So XP JavaScript components are not SDCs, they're not related to it, but it does have full JavaScript components and it renders with Astro.
Yep.
And there is an experimental JSX partial engine in there, so I was
Yep.
curious.
Yeah, that'll be hard to summarize for the recording, but yeah, SDCs are all kinds of very interesting things. They're using Astro to be able to use framework components, and one of the cool things about Astro is all Astro is doing there is actually just creating custom elements for things. So it's custom elements all the way down. And yeah, if you haven't seen some of the Experience Builder demos or tried it out, there also is a way to essentially write your own JavaScript components inside of Experience Builder, which is wild, and Tailwind is available to you, so the possibilities are definitely expanding there. Anything else? Yes?
I was just wondering, is there any discussion of making the directory structure for single directory components a little more flexible, so it can match up a little better with a storybook like
Yep.
listed components?
Yeah, so the question was, is there any discussion about making the directory structure a little bit more flexible? My understanding, based on like following along with the initial development of this, that was kind of an explicit design decision to force things to be simple and a little bit rigid in how they need to be handled. So I think that was an intentional decision, which makes me think it's unlikely that it would change. But I also don't know. I really haven't kept up.
But that being said, you can nest folders like you would with Atomic Design. So you can have your atoms, all your single directory components in an atom folder and a subfolder as well. So you can still kind of use that layout as you want. The only thing that matters in the directory is that those 3 files or those 2 files are in there, in that one, the same named folder.
But you couldn't put them in a top level directory called David, for example. It's got to be components.
So you can have subdirectories within components?
Correct.
And then it'll, okay.
Kind of like the templates directory.
Yeah.
Change the name.
Cool. Anything else? Yes.
Just a quick question. Since you said there's no build process, does Astro not need a build process?
So Astro does have a build process. So on the prototyping side, there was a build process, but on Drupal, there was not.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Cool. I know it's lunchtime, so we can let everybody go. But thank you very much. Yeah.